for this panel, we have three distinguished speakers, and their talks are going to be around the broad but very interesting theme of post-liberal conservative perspectives and principles. And our first speaker, Eric Hoffman, will be beamed in remotely. Eric is a professor of, before I move on to that, if you have taken any photographs or you've taken notes of what speakers have said, please put them on social media. And if you do put them on social media, we'd be most grateful if you could use the hashtag post-liberal, so we can all engage with one another, share with those, and enhance our community of post-liberal. If you're not opposed to those interested in post-liberal and future of conservatism, and that will enhance, I think, our conference. So if you could do that, I'll be most grateful. So Eric is a professor of politics at Birkbeck College, University of London in the United Kingdom. I recommend his book to you, White Shift, Immigration, Populism and the Future of White Majorities. It's an incredibly interesting read. Also, The Rise and Fall of Anglo-America, that was published in Harvard 2004, and The Orange Order. He's also the co-editor of Political Demography, which is also very interesting. He's been published in places like the New York Times, Times of London, Financial Times. There are other newspapers without the name Times in as well, like the Wall Street Journal. So I think by magic, we can put Eric onto the screen and he will delight us with his presentation.
Am I there yet? Yeah. Okay, sorry, I just saw the bottom. Anyhow, thank you very much. I dearly wished I could have been with you. I unfortunately got COVID just a few days before, and I'm still just getting a thin second line, so I'm afraid I can't come, which is a real shame. But thank you for organizing such a wonderful conference. I know many of you anyway. Today, essentially, the title of my talk is Toward a Liberal Post-Liberalism. And we heard John O'Sullivan earlier talk about many things in liberalism being admirable, and I think I share that view of John's, that actually many things are worth conserving in liberalism. The principles that particularly I find interesting and important are those of procedural liberalism, constitutional liberties, free speech, due process, equal treatment under the law, scientific reason, orderly transfers of power in democracy. That these are not just compatible with a revival of conservative cultural values, but are absolutely necessary for them to succeed. So the first message really is, I actually think liberals and conservatives have a lot in common, and we have a lot of common challenges. A very powerful challenge, which I would call a cultural emergency. We really need to work with sensible classical liberals on this common challenge, common threat. Because I think what we have in our culture, and I do think culture is pretty much the only issue conservatives should be focusing on. I think the other issues are largely peripheral, really need to be focusing on cultural questions. What we face is as institutionalized anti-conservatism in high culture. More than that, actually political prejudice, which is often quite open in terms of a whole series of things, everything from hiring to promotion to whether you want your child to marry somebody who is a conservative. And I think that a pushback in the culture that moves it towards a more free speech oriented and tolerant culture will very much help to allow conservatism to flourish in a way that it can't now because of these strong prejudices that exist in the high culture. So I think we need to work with true liberals, not people who go by the name liberal, but are actually what I would term cultural socialists. We need to work with true liberals against the dominant progressivism in the elite culture. And that is, in a way, subverting not only conservatism, but liberalism itself. I think we need to focus laser-like on culture, the hour is late, actually. And one of my frustrations with many conservatives, including populist conservatives, is the degree to which they become distracted by what I consider political economic issues, which really are in many ways, I think, secondary. It's not that I don't have views on foreign policy and economics and vaccines and so on, but these really are not central and should not be sucking up as much energy from conservatives as they have been. And not only that, some conservatives have fallen into the trap of actually going towards political illiberalism and saying warm things about autocrats, which is a real own goal as far as the core concerns, which have to be cultural. So it's vital, therefore, I think that conservatism stand with liberals when it comes to resisting autocracy, to stand for political liberalism and freedom. But because what I see really emerging, and this is through a lot of my work on social surveys and public opinion, is we have a rising generation that is deeply illiberal and deeply prejudiced against conservatives, much more so than older generations. And even if you control for political ideology, a far leftist over the age of 55 is 30 to 40 points in many cases more tolerant than a far leftist under the age of 30. So we have a huge looming problem, and this is not because these people are young and don't own a home. People have to disabuse themselves. This is not an economic problem. This is a mind virus that has gripped the conscience of a lot of younger people. And this is something we have to get serious about. And we cannot pretend that economic salves are going to change this. We're in a struggle between what I term cultural socialism and cultural liberalism, which is actually more also compatible with conservatism. The cultural liberal worldview, again, is about free speech, equal treatment, due process, scientific rationality. The cultural socialist worldview is about psychological and emotional protection for historically marginalized identity groups, and it is about equal outcomes for identity groups. That is the overriding value set for cultural socialism, and they are willing to sacrifice civil liberties to those values. And this is something I outlined in the Manhattan Institute report that I recently did on the culture war in the United States. You can see question after question these big divides, and generation is a major predictor of more intolerance. So this culture war is, I think, going to define our politics in the next few decades. The big questions are going to be cultural rather than economic, and we really need to get conservatives much more on that page. What we face is not a classical authoritarianism of the Putin variety, but an emergent authoritarianism from below. Thinking of society in two layers as state and individual is outmoded. We need to think in terms of three layers: the state, administrative institutions in the middle, and citizens below. And much of the authoritarianism and the threat to liberty is coming from that middle layer of institutions, stimulated by activists who are trying to change culture from below and trying to lean on these institutions to enforce their dictates. And what they're hoping to create is a deeply intolerant culture. Some of you may have seen the New York Times piece against cancel culture that's just come out, and some of the comments are really revealing. A lot of progressives think, hey, this is just consequences. If I don't like your speech and I shun you, that's just consequences. In their worldview, being politically prejudiced has nothing to do with being illiberal. It's really quite astounding. You have a whole section of society that does not believe in a free speech culture. That's something that needs to change. And we need to do something to change that and work with good faith liberals to do that. This political intolerance stems from the fact that ideology, political beliefs, are the most important identity for many on the cultural left who dominate in our institutions. That 8% in the US and 13% in Britain identified by Moore & Common's Hidden Tribes report as the so-called progressive activists, disproportionately metropolitan and white, heavily educated. This group is deeply illiberal. They believe that if you say something that shows you're a conservative or that offends or could potentially offend a member of a historically marginalized group, it's open season on you and you can be dehumanized and demonized. Deeply illiberal creed. And so we have this problem of growing political intolerance from the cultural left. And I see this as a sort of key force that conservatives need to fight against. And it's rooted in wokeness, which actually has a scientific definition, which is the sacralization, making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. So that sacralization leads to the intolerance which underpins this new cultural socialism. And you see it in many ways. For example, you can see if you take Ivy League students, the FIRE surveys contain about 55,000 students from the top 150 universities in the United States, that you can see the willingness to date a Republican or willingness to date a Trump supporter is, it is sort of around 10%. It's extremely low amongst those who are not already Trump supporters. I mean, this is sort of, now you may say that's trivial, everyone can date whoever they like, except for the fact that that attitude is also connected to being willing to discriminate against a Republican for a job, and also to be in favor of cancel culture. So we have this political intolerance rooted in this sacralization of minorities. This has got to be a key focus for conservative politics, this focus on the cultural. It should be dwarfing other factors. Now, it's, of course, comes along with other conservative, culturally conservative, post-liberal programs, including controlled immigration, for example, including emphasizing the importance of social cohesion. But I think this has to be a central focus that brings liberals, classical liberals and conservatives together, and that going after too many other issues, such as the vaccine issue, such as lowering tax, such as net zero, such as foreign policy. I think these are distractions. By all means, have policies on these, but don't pour your energy into them, because they are second order issues, I believe. Because we're living through the heyday of the cultural left, the ideology that I term left modernism, which emerged in the early 1900s as an attack by white Anglo-Saxon Protestant left-wing intellectuals in the United States against their own ethnic group. We see that emerging strongly in the 1910s with figures like Randolph Bourne, for example, who urged members of his sort of those of New England Yankee background to basically become cosmopolitan, turn their back on their own ethnic group, and embrace diversity and multicultural diversity. While at the same time urging ethnic minorities not to lose their identity and not to assimilate. That paradigm, which dates from the mid-1910s, has more or less strengthened, especially since the 1960s. But what's happened is that the modernist half of left modernism, the emphasis on that Daniel Bell analyzed in his book, The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism, which is a very influential book for me, this idea of diversity, change, anti-tradition, that was sort of the first thrust of modernism in art and architecture and so forth. But then that has been joined by cultural socialism, this idea of elevating historically marginalized groups as being more virtuous and more moral, also more fragile and more in need of white saviorism. But almost a kind of worship of these groups as totems, as somehow unsullied by modernity. And that sort of morphed into this deeply intolerant cultural socialism, which is drawing more and more support from younger people. I mentioned that. So, for example, the firing of James Damore, the Google engineer who questioned the firm's gender identity policies, just bringing up scientific facts on an internal memo. 2/3 of people under 25 in my surveys in the United States and in Britain favor the firing of Damore, compared to only barely 1/3 of those over the age of 55. And I think that kind of gives you an indication of what's coming down the road. And I don't think we're prepared for this. A few editorials at the New York Times or The Economist is not going to put a stop to this, or Harper's. It's just not going to put a stop. This is baked into the generational cake. These people will be entering our organizations and upending the more tolerant culture that already exists there. So we are going to have to actually fight a cultural battle against this growing tide of intolerance and anti-conservative prejudice that is rising. And I think Ed West captures a lot of this quite well in his book, Small Men on the Wrong Side of History, actually. The agent, the sort of advance guard for this revolution is that middle layer of institutions, the HR departments, the human rights commissions, if we're talking about Canada, the illiberal speech norms in elite institutions and elite social circles, the kangaroo courts within these institutions, some of which I've been on the receiving end of, and some of you may have been as well. And then finally, of course, hate speech laws and regulation of the internet, which are very much, again, politically slanted. This cultural socialism is rooted in the 1960s ideas of Marcuse on repressive tolerance, this idea of not tolerating conservative ideas because somehow they will magically lead to authoritarianism. Of course, that's never demonstrated, and there's no empirical evidence for that. But hey, I mean, while you're letting your prejudices rip, why not go all the way? So what we've got then is this looming cultural socialism that is seeping into all our institutions, that is conquering in a way from the bottom up. It's not a classical top-down Putin-esque kind of authoritarianism. I think conservatives need to work with centrist liberals to try and fight against this tide. And here I would sort of distinguish between liberalism in terms of procedure, liberalism in law and politics, and the word liberalism, which is sometimes used to also mean modernism in Bell's terminology, that anti-traditionalism, and cultural socialism in the arts and culture. I actually don't believe there is any logical connection between procedural liberalism and this left modernism, which has exploded since the 1960s. You can have a liberal framework, and they have it in places like Korea and Japan. You can have a procedural liberal framework, but simply have a different set of cultural values grafted onto that liberal framework. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to evolve towards left modernism. Daniel Bell, for example, talks about being a liberal in politics and a conservative in culture. That's sort of what I'm driving at. Isaiah Berlin makes the distinction between negative and positive liberalism. We need negative liberalism. We need that idea of procedural liberty without the positive liberty, the forcing. A good example of this is you need to tolerate diversity in a liberal society, but you do not need to prefer diversity in a liberal society. So the idea of celebrating and preferring diversity is a coercive left modernist idea, but the idea of tolerating diversity is a negative liberal idea I think we should all be on board with. So I'm very much in favor of defending negative liberal principles such as free speech, equal treatment, due process, and so on against its enemies, whether authoritarians abroad, as in Russia and China, or the emergent authoritarians of the woke left, which are surging through our institutions. In the last section, what I want to do is sort of look at the how. How do we get there? And I'm not sure this is always fleshed through enough. I think we really have to get serious about bureaucracy and about the state. We have a problem in that a lot of politicians, even populist politicians, talk a lot, have great sound bites, but don't have the policy follow through and the policy chops. We saw that with Trump to a large extent. Even though there are some of his policies which he enacted, such as with regard to the border, which I think were effective, in a lot of cases, there was a lot of talk with very little policy follow through. With Boris Johnson and the Conservatives, we have the reverse problem. There are some useful policy entrepreneurs, people like Kemi Badenoch, for example. You have the Sewell Report, the Academic Freedom Bill. There are some people doing some good things, but Johnson is too shy and too timid to actually make this central to his pitch. He's shying away from the culture war, because he's not really committed to it, it seems to me. It's not really what he's about. But secondly, simply being scared of the progressive media and what it's going to say about him and his party. So what you actually need is a combination of people who are willing to campaign on and talk about the culture war issues, but also to have a systematic plan to march back through these institutions which are advancing the ideas of cultural socialism and subverting the will of the majority of the population. If you look at the actions of a Chris Rufo, the activist in the United States, and some of the things Ron DeSantis has done around critical race theory. Now, I don't agree with bans on critical race theory in universities, but I do agree with bans on critical race theory in K-12 education. And I think Rufo and DeSantis have done a very good job with pushing that. And it just shows that sort of practical politics, the organization, getting the draft legislation that you can then roll out across different states. You have to have that effective policy network to get things done. And we need a concerted program then to take back the institutions. It is not illiberal for elected governments to override the will of public institutions, apart from those such as the courts, which have constitutionally specified autonomy, and that must be respected. With universities, the individual lecturers and professors' autonomy and freedom must be respected, but not the right of the universities themselves to, for example, cancel and fire and impose whatever values they feel on their staff and students. So not the institution, but the individuals within universities should have rights that are protected, but not the institution. So other than these institutions, such as courts and to some degree universities, it's very important that the government actually go into and try and intervene and reform institutions and open them up to political scrutiny with the aim of making them politically neutral and more representative of society than they are. Otherwise, they are going to simply recruit from the same set of people with the same beliefs, which reproduces a constituency that's very sort of sympathetic to cultural socialism. And this doesn't matter whether we're talking about the Equality and Human Rights Commission, the BBC, or even to some degree, universities reproducing their, in Britain, 9-to-1 left to right skew, or in the United States, 14-to-1 left to right skew, if we're talking about the social sciences. I prioritize the liberty of individuals over that of the autonomy of institutions in my liberalism. And so if an institution wants to oppress an individual, I think it is legitimate for the government to step in and interdict that institution and prevent it from oppressing the liberty of the individual. And that means employees should have the right to express themselves freely on social media, for example, without facing punishment for legal speech, unless the employer can prove to a very high level that this is detrimental to their job performance. We need protection for freedom of speech in employees. Institutions, again, I would place as secondary. I don't think universities should be free, again, to impose woke values on their staff, to impose political litmus tests like diversity, equity, and inclusion statements on staff before they're allowed to be employed. That should be prevented by a government regulator who should step in and essentially say that's a violation of the academic's freedom. So I believe that government has a role in restricting the freedom of institutions and trying to reform them in order to free up individuals. It's also, I think, extremely important that we tackle political discrimination in these institutions, which is rampant, anti-conservative political discrimination. For example, just in surveys I've done of UK universities, I found that 1 in 3 British academics would not hire a known Brexit supporter. In the US, 40% of American social science and humanities academics would not hire a known Trump supporter for a job. Many other studies have shown similar levels of discrimination in terms of refereeing papers, promotion applications, and so on. Political discrimination on the basis of political belief should not be tolerated in institutions, and also is already recognized by the courts as a protected belief. And I think we need to actually lean into that idea of political belief as being a protected characteristic. And that then means that institutions will have to take account of the fact, if they are practicing political discrimination, then that is going to be something that government can go after them for. Also, by the way, if they have an equity and diversity program that's only interested in race and gender, I think it is legitimate to say anything you do on race and gender equity, anything you do on anti-discrimination must be matched by similar measures on political equity and anti-discrimination. I think that's a legitimate principle, and I think that would have a massive effect. I also think that conservatives...
Eric,
yeah.
Do you think you could bring it to a conclusion for me, please?
Okay, fine. Yeah, so I guess I see if you look at the Federalist Society and the US Supreme Court, the way they organize a policy network, the way they scrutinize legislators, the way they work to get their people in, that is something that conservatism has to get better at, placing its people in these government bureaucracies in order to not only change policy, but institute those changes. So to conclude, I've argued that conservatives need to work with liberals against the looming threat from cultural socialism. This is about implementing reforms that are very congenial to liberalism, the idea of opposing political discrimination, opposing threats to free speech, and creating a space for conservatism, which is being foreclosed right now by anti-conservative bias. And this means decentering the idea of equality of outcome for protected identity groups, decentering the notion that equity is the only thing that matters in culture, and actually saying, yes, equity is one value, but it's one value alongside others such as national pride, social cohesion, excellence, freedom, and tradition. So again, to conclude, what I'd argue is for a liberal post-liberalism that works with negative liberty, with centrist liberals on our common challenges. Thank you.
Brilliant, Eric. Thank you very much. That was marvelous. And now we turn to our second distinguished speaker, James Orr. I'm very excited to hear what James has to say. James is an assistant professor of philosophy of religion at the Faculty of Divinity, University of Cambridge. I would highly recommend reading his book, The Mind of God and the Works of Nature, and also his co-edited volume on Neo-Aristotelian metaphysics and the theology of nature. He's very interested in campaigning around academic freedom, freedom of speech, patriotism, nationhood, and of course around the very important issue of bioethics arising at the beginning of life. His talk will be on In the Wake of the Great Unwindings, Christianity and the Future of Post-Liberalism. Thank you very much.
Dan, thank you very much indeed. And thank you to Philip for inviting me for this, putting together this wonderful conference. Thank you to John for hosting us in his capacity as director of the Danube Institute. It's been wonderful to make so many new friendships and to see so many old friends too. But I'm so grateful for this invitation, but a little bit surprised too. As Daniel pointed out, I work in metaphysics, Neo-Aristotelianism, and you may well be a little baffled yourself as to what this could have to do with the themes that we're addressing today, and I hope all will become clear. And I think one of the things I want to suggest to avoid furious agreement with Eric, our previous speaker, is that procedural liberalism is missing a key ingredient when it comes to confronting this aggressive rival ideology that is ripping apart the institutional landscape of the West. And I'm going to suggest that that missing ingredient is metaphysics, or a rival metaphysical vision of what it is to be human, of what reciprocity is about, of what community is about. And without that, procedural liberalism ain't going to cut it. So that's going to be roughly the theme of what you're about to hear. And that's my justification, I think, for the very kind invitation. As I reflected a little more on post-liberalism and preparing this talk, I realized that one of the most arresting features of the many and various thinkers who stand under the banner of post-liberalism, whatever we decide at the end of the day that actually means, is a shared seriousness about metaphysics. And metaphysics, by metaphysics, let's just say that's a shorthand word for substantive questions to do with meaning, existence, goodness, beauty, dignity, the nature of reality, and what it is to be a human being. So just take the word metaphysics as just distilled shorthand for that. And however integral liberal proceduralism's requirement might be that we have a kind of neutral agnosticism in the public square, however integral that might be to sustaining and holding together a genuinely plural polity, and I share Eric and John's commitment to that, to that mechanism that liberalism provides. I still think that in the end, liberalism leads us to increasingly illiberal restrictions on forms of life that refuse to accept that metaphysical substantive questions are fit for discussion by, they effectively restrict these questions to discussion between consenting adults behind closed doors. The remarkably successful marriage between British conservatism and Lockean liberalism is attributable in part to a kind of an ingrained suspicion, I think, in the national temper towards grand speculative theorizing. That's a very conservative disposition, of course. We are, after all, the nation of David Hume, for whom metaphysics was but sophistry and illusion to be committed to the flames. We're the nation of Jeremy Bentham, for whom these rights coming over from continental Europe were nonsense, imprescriptible nonsense, nonsense upon stilts. And we are the land of Sir Roger Scruton, more recently, who I think shared Kant's critique of reason's tendency always to overreach itself. And in many ways, I think Roger reinscribed in contemporary conservatism an unduly liberal Kantian agnosticism towards beauty, goodness, ensoulment, and divinity as fundamental features of reality that stand before us, that summon us, that make demands of us, that we discover and do not construct in the Kantian vein. Conservatives are then instinctively drawn to this skeptical posture on the big questions, just as they are instinctively drawn, I think, to Oakeshott's politics of skepticism that Chris illuminated so brilliantly this morning. But what I find most bracing and encouraging about post-liberals is what I'll call their metaphysical swagger on these questions. And I should stress again that it's not quite clear to me yet what unites post-liberals beyond just a sort of rather negative diagnosis or recognition that liberalism is unraveling, and with it the boundaries between left and right as they used to be, both of which I think in the eyes of the post-liberal are tacitly kind of complicit in the liberal project. But I think if that's all that post-liberalism means, then what's on offer is hardly, I think, a foundation for a distinctive common political vision. But again, this is something that's coming together over the course of the day. Now, the paradox is that for me, as a confessing and out-of-the-closet Christian in the University of Cambridge, as well as a conservative, is that I'm confronted with a national church, the Church of England, an established church, no less, that is racked with division over how best to manage its slow collapse. And when adherence to institutional Christianity among the population at large is dramatically on the wane. And the paradox is, however, that the influence of self-consciously theological critiques of liberalism has never been stronger. And I'm thinking here, well, looking across the pond to the United States, we have figures such as Rod Dreher, who's with us today, Patrick Deneen, Adrian Vermeulen. On the conservative side in the UK, of course, there's Philip, whose politics are, I think, ultimately rooted in a project that orients society towards Augustine's common objects of love. I think of Danny Kruger and his stress on faith and family, on covenant, not contract, as the key to achieving the common good. Or on the British left and the Labour Party, Blue Labour, thinking here of John Milbank and Adrian Pabst and Rowan Williams. There are real differences, of course, between these figures, but I think they all emerge from metaphysically serious theological hinterlands and have been formed by them and have confidence, more confidence perhaps than the clerics in the Church of England do, to defend these positions in the public square. So what animates post-liberalism's distinctive blend of radicalism and conservatism, I think, are its commitments to human dignity, human imperfectibility, to gift, to reciprocity, and to the transcendent, however construed, as foundational metaphysical realities. And as a number of secular historians have pointed out, I'm thinking of Larry Siedentop and Tom Holland and many others, these commitments emerge unmistakably, just as a historical matter, descriptive historical matter, from theological traditions. That doesn't make them true, of course, but that's, I think, an accurate genealogy. Put differently, it often seems as if post-liberalism's strength at offering a diagnosis of the present and a prescription for the future is its pre-liberalism, and in particular the residue it carries forward of a Christian metaphysic that blends together the currents of Hellenic and Hebraic thought. Metaphysics always buries its undertakers, and the undertaker that philosophically confident post-liberals have buried is John Rawls, surely the thinker nearest to sainthood in the canon of contemporary liberalism and in politics faculties up and right across the West. It was just over 50 years ago last year, that Rawls introduces his famous procedure in A Theory of Justice for devising the maximally distributively just society, a procedure that in which he insisted on the methodological exclusion of, quote, comprehensive doctrines. As Rawls puts it, when trying to devise this society in behind what he calls the veil of ignorance, we must assume, quote, that the parties do not know their conceptions of the good. The principles of justice are chosen behind a veil of ignorance. They do not know. We are not allowed to avail ourselves of what our conception, of any conception of the good, in order to work out what the principles of justice are. Just a quick side note here. We've moved from Plato's foundational commitment in the Republic that the just society can only be constructed through a true apprehension of the good, to 1971 Rawls, the only way to devise a just society is by ignoring any conception of the good. So the dissent roiling the Western public square at the moment suggests that we cannot, in fact, bracket our conceptions of the good, not least because that means bracketing our conceptions of the good for human beings, and therefore why we should care about what just principles for human beings might be. We cannot begin to think about how to create a society that makes good people, in Danny's expression from this morning, if we are not allowed to discuss, let alone agree upon, an account of the good. Metaphysics matters because metaphysics motivates. But a metaphysic for the masses is a possibility only if it is religiously charged in some way. Procedural liberalism and secular agnosticism don't set off moral revolutions. In liberalism's short lifespan, it is Christianity, and most often Christianity from the edges of institutional Christianity, not Lockean liberalism, that has transformed modernity's moral universe at least 3 times. I'm thinking here of Thomas Clarkson, the great Cambridge undergraduate, who turned his essay on Aristotle into a manifesto that led, in the end, to the abolition of the slave trade, and then in 1807, and then slavery in 1836. I'm thinking of the Thomistic Catholic personalism of Jacques Maritain, who was one of the energizing forces behind the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights in 1948. And, of course, think of the charged rhetoric, the biblically charged rhetoric and logic and rationale of Martin Luther King, and the role that he played, of course, in mobilizing the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s. I adduce these arguments, these examples, not as an apologetic for Christianity, but as a suggestion, as an indication that it's pre-political metaphysical commitments, not ideology, not procedure, that procedural commitments that achieve the progress that progressivism is perpetually striving for, but almost never attains. In this case, in those 3 cases, to the absolute objectivity of human moral worth, against the many and various forms of positivism and behaviorism and naturalism, reductive metaphysics of the human that dovetails so neatly with the metaphysical quietism and agnosticism of procedural liberalism. Sorry, Eric. For some conservatives, hyper-progressivism is an aberration, not of liberalism, but a mutation of Christianity, or perhaps a resurgence of the Marxist dichotomy between proletariat and bourgeoisie projected onto oppressor and oppressed, construed slightly differently. And I think there's some truth in these genealogies. These things are never straightforwardly unifactorial. But to return to a point that John O'Sullivan conceded to some extent in his opening remarks this morning in his qualified defense of liberal conservatism, I do think that progressivism is an intrinsic feature, a predictable outworking of liberalism, at least when the conservative impulse is too weak to restrain it within culture. And I think here we do well to remind ourselves of Kenneth Minogue's famous parable of St. George and the Dragon, which I'm not sure how familiar you'll be. Here's a little excerpt from it. The story of liberalism, as liberals tell it, is rather like the legend of St. George and the Dragon. After many centuries of hopelessness and superstition, St. George, in the guise of, capital R, rationality, appeared in the world somewhere about the 16th century. The first dragons upon whom he turned his lance were those of despotic kingship and religious tolerance. These battles won, he rested a time, until such questions as slavery or prison conditions or the state of the poor began to command his attention. During the 19th century, his lance was never still, prodding this way and that against the inert scaliness of privilege, vested interest, or patrician insolence. But, unlike St. George, he did not know when to retire. The more he succeeded, the more he became bewitched with the idea of a world free of dragons. and the less capable he became of ever returning to private life. He needed his dragons. He could only live by fighting for causes, the people, the poor, the exploited, the colonial oppressed, the underprivileged and the undeveloped. As an aging warrior, he grew breathless in his pursuit of smaller and smaller dragons, for the big dragons were harder to come by. End quote. This accelerating mutation of liberalism into illiberalism that Minogue's parable illuminates is why conservatives must, I think, in the British context and beyond, be willing to set aside their ingrained skepticism and defend conceptions of human nature and human worth, and why we cannot afford the luxury of a prudent pragmatism that has served us so well at the ballot box in the past. The reason is that, the reason it must do this is that the United Kingdom, along with the rest of the West, but not the rest, now confronts a powerful vision of the human that presses a laudable liberal humanism in the direction of anti-human extremes. And as that metaphysical vision takes on an indisputably religious cast, it's disseminated with staggering speed and unprecedented levels of unconscious coordination all around the English-speaking world. Hyper-progressivism is, as Eric has argued in a number of places, an emergent ideology. It's acephalous, it's decentralized. It is transnational to an extraordinary extent, such that the tragic killing of a man 5,000 miles away in an American city can, within 48 hours, lead British academics to be asking themselves about the ethnicity of the authors on the curricular content of their undergraduate classes. This is quite extraordinary and without precedent as far as I'm aware. Identitarianism is a liquid ideology, dissolving all the customs and conventions that unify and differentiate a moral culture. And of course, it snaps the Rawlsian guardrails. It has its priestly castes, prophetic laments, rituals and chants, liturgical calendars, elaborate hierarchies, martyrologies, heretics and apostates, doctrines of sin, mortal and venal, a web of shibboleths, a kind of woke idiolect that signals cult membership and constrains admission into it. Reality, on this view, is riven through and through by a metaphysical conflict between good and evil, between, that is, oppressor and oppressed. Some are good, and some are made good by their possession of certain contingent physiological characteristics. Others are bad because they belong to a group associated with Western civilization historically in some way, through which original sin flowed into the world and all our woe. These judgments of good and evil are extrinsic judgments. They're extrinsic attributes. They've got nothing to do with the character or behavior of individual moral agents. But individuals can acquire virtue if they step away from the oppressor caste to embrace, quote, allyship, and individuals in the oppressed caste can lose it if they reject membership of the caste or criticize it. The world is fallen because of Western domination, and its fallenness is starkest in the disparities between particular population groups. But salvation can be attained by doing the work of deconstructing the entire institutional landscape of Western society. So these commitments, I want to say, run deep, as I think Eric recognizes. They are not transient, they're not performative political attitudes, and they're going to continue until internal tensions overwhelm the ideology, or some cataclysmic event, a war, or a really serious plague occurs that amplifies its threat to public order. The ideology has grown from a minor irritation, amplified by social media, into a phenomenon that threatens the legal and medical professions, the armed forces, the security services, areas where specialized vocational knowledge is now transmitted through a distorting and highly contestable ideological prism. These professions may not count many conservatives among them, but without them, no conservative political project for the restoration of society can possibly succeed. As these confected identities proliferate, only the state emerges as the actor that can regulate them. Hence the need for statutory recognition and mechanisms of enforcement, whether it's the stick of legal address or the carrot of a place on the register of champions, and allies by various often government-funded kite-marking institutions. As the power of the state to recognize and regulate increasingly fine-grained distinctions in the identity claims of its citizens grows, the power of every individual citizen is eroded, and the web of intermediating institutions unravels. Roger Scruton once said that conservatism is a hesitation within liberalism. And if that's true, then conservatism is what makes liberalism, if conservatism is what makes liberalism hesitate, then the weakening of conservatism as a cultural and political force means that there will be nothing left to save liberalism from itself. Moving on to the how, and to finish with this, what can be done about this? Well, it's become fashionable in some post-liberal circles to complain of elite overproduction, and in particular what Joel Kotkin has called a progressive clerisy. This is Coleridge's word. Coleridge's term for a web of influence connected to the church, but one that reaches through government, civil service, universities, commentators, includes commentators, artists, opinion makers, the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And this secular clerisy today, Kotkin argues, though tiny in raw numerical terms, relatively speaking, fixes and polices the parameters of the sayable and sets the tone for the culture. And it seems to me that populist attempts to dismantle the metropolitan elite were always doomed and are almost always, without exception, almost always abject failures. I suggest what is needed, and in fact what has begun to emerge in recent years, is a counter-clerisy. Since I see Rod sitting over there, I think we could call it the Coleridge option. Amidst the great unwinding of liberalism and the collapse of institutional religion, I think that a theologically grounded post-liberalism can diffuse itself through society via coordinated but decentralized networks of actors spanning every institution and sector and forging tactical coalitions to bring about its own vision of the common good. If we cannot get rid of an elite, we need an alternative, nimbler rival elite, as I said, a counter-clerisy. Intellectuals, policymakers, lawyers, funders, as David reminded us, very important. Not a movement, perhaps, but a loose coalition of fellow travelers united by varying degrees of skepticism towards liberalism, open to anyone of good faith, and invested in transforming an elite from within by means of a counter-elite. And there are many examples of this which we could discuss in the Q&A. I'm thinking of History Reclaimed, which has been quietly and sometimes publicly challenging attempts by the progressives to create a kind of historical ground zero on statues and plaques and so on. Don't Divide Us, a counter-clerisy of academics determined to resist the indoctrination of staff and students at our great universities. Briefings for Britain, a superb platform setting out a positive vision for post-Brexit Britain, and so on and so on and so on. The Free Speech Union, a counter-clerisy of liberals, conservatives and socialists that I'm proud to be associated with, who've done more to protect freedom of conscience and expression than any government in living memory in the last two years. So just to conclude, I want to suggest that post-liberals should persuade British conservatives to wield the power they're so good at winning, but not always so competent at wielding. And the only way of challenging the left liberal consensus, left modernism, as Eric has it, that has driven social liberalism and with it an economic liberalism, as Philip was pointing out earlier, is to articulate and defend a more substantive vision of dignity and freedom, forgiveness and reciprocity, place and nation, one rooted in our fundamental convictions about the nature of reality as gift and human nature as given, one that could then reverse the rootless tyranny of liberalism without restraint.
Thank you very much, James. That was very entertaining and intellectually stimulating. Much appreciated. Next, we have Philip Blond. As Philip was introduced earlier, I'd just like to say a few things that holds a chair at the University of Public Service. I would highly recommend that you go back and reread Red Tory, which I did recently. It's amazing to think that it was published in 2010, but to think back and to see how pertinent it is today, is quite extraordinary, really. Also, I'd recommend, I'm interested in constitution, so have a look at the report on the city-states and devolution, and also Devo Max. They were published 2014-15. They're very important and interesting papers. Over to you, Philip.
Well, thank you. Wonderful. How marvelous, and how to begin. There are many ways to begin, but I think I'll begin with the war in Ukraine, not least because my brother-in-law is Lieutenant Colonel in Mariupol, leading the Ukrainian defense of that city, and his two young boys, who are just older than my two young boys, are still trapped in the city. And the Russians are expressly trying to kill civilians in that city. And so much so that they purposely shoot at the windows of cars that have notices pinned to the windows saying children. And they purposely shoot and try to kill women and children fleeing from those cities, because that's what they do. That's their strategy, because they think it brings about societal collapse of their enemies. And the reason I bring it up is a division within post-liberalism that I think has emerged between, let's say, post-liberal Brits and some post-liberal Americans who are my friends. They're my friends. I like them. I like their work. I'm thinking of the op-ed published on February the 5th by Patrick Deneen, Sloab Arami, and Gladden Pippin in the New York Times, that basically eschewed imperialism and foreign adventure as liberal and called instead for a retreat, and that's my pejorative phrase, but you'll understand why I use it, to a type of concern for the locality, concern for the present, concern for at home and not doing war abroad. And then I thought, well, what are my ultimate problems also with certain versions of Central European post-liberalism, the domestic policies of which I both admire and support? And I'm thinking of the Central European nationalism that has driven what used to be, well, it's driven wars, and it's driven what used to be hugely multi-ethnic states into ethnic monostates. So Poland, a country I greatly admire, that my country is rightly allied with, is now 98% Polish. Pre-First World War, it was around 30%, and there were Hungarians there were Jewish people there. The whole of Central Europe was multivalent, and the legacy of our wars has produced these homogenous, ethnocentric language group states. And I think when looking at my American friends and then at my Central European friends and agreeing with them on so much of domestic policy, what I don't agree with them on is nationalism. What I don't agree with them on is eschewing the universal. What I don't agree with them on is having a purely nationally circumscribed good. To me, that isn't post-liberal. It's certainly not Christian. It's liberal. It's a clear, and first-year students know this, it's a clear aspect of political philosophy and history that nationalism is a liberal project. You can just think of it even at the level of reflection. The notion of an unconstrained individual, homogenous, self-determining, is just recast at the collective level. Homogenous, self-determined nation, same as a self-legislating singular subject. And what I want to suggest to you is that this is not good enough. This is not good enough for a post-liberal polity, and this is not good enough for an international offer. What I've argued in a very long essay some of which I may subject you to, so apologies in advance, in the University Journal of UPS called Pro Bono, is that we need, as post-liberals, to recover the internationalist dimension. We need to recover empire from a purely pejorative phrase, and we need to recover the notion of the imperial from its purely pejorative stance. Why is that? Because the good is imperial, because the good is universal. And the mark of Western civilization is monotheism, the universalization of God away from arbitrary powers. Those half-educated who eulogize polytheism fail to see that the polytheistic gods are arbitrary power personified. They each rule without governance from the good over their respective domains. And what governs the polytheistic pantheon is a deity that just happens to have more power. It is not accidental that the birth of justice and the birth of monotheism are synonymous. Indeed, the mark of Judaism was the eruption of the universal in the world that even the king had to obey. The Jewish prophets didn't come in and say, whatever the king says is right. And all anthropology up to the Jewish prophets, the local chieftain or king dictated the ideology of the priesthood. With Judaism, you have actually, the king has to obey the law as well. Judaism is the birth of politics. Monotheism is the birth of politics. And you'll know from your Genesis that Israel was to be a light for all nations. This wasn't just a God for Israel. This is where I'm in fundamental disagreement with another friend, Hazoni. I think this is completely wrong account of Judaism. Israel was a priestly nation that was there to bring the light of the universal to all nations. So all nations could govern by something other than ethnic self-interest and violence. So, what am I suggesting? What I want to suggest to you is that if post-liberalism is to be substantive, and I completely agree with James, is that it cannot be restricted to merely localist paradigms. We cannot have a good that is just good for the Hungarians. We cannot have a good that is just good for the British. Indeed, the British, and I strongly would defend the social and economic consequences of the British Empire, which essentially extolled the universal to an incredible extent across the whole globe, so much so that it waged war against slavery for 3 generations and freed hundreds of thousands of slaves on both east and west side of Africa, which was not a product of self-interest. So if post-liberalism is not to be nationalist, it is at the same time not to ignore the nation. It does believe in affinity. It does believe in preference. It is Burkean in the sense that it is led to the universal by love of the particular. It proceeds from love of family to love of humanity as a whole. Now, if we do not, as post-liberals, embrace the universal, we will lose the battle with liberalism. Because what is right about liberalism is it fights on a universal basis. It captures all idealism and says that we own the ideal and everything that is not us is not ideal. And that will win 100 times out of 100 over any self-interested defense of particularity. 100 times out of 100. If we are serious about the world being governed by something other than liberalism, we have to be serious about universals and post-liberalism and what that means. And we have to contest the liberal model of universals. So let me do that now. I hadn't intended to say all this, but it's just from the nature of the discussions we've had. Where I differ from very good colleagues and friends in the audience and presenting is they rightly defend liberalism, but they cannot defend liberalism on liberal principles. Let me tell you what liberal principles are. And there is, by the way, as you all know, liberty before liberalism. You all recall Quentin Skinner's book from your first year course, Liberty Before Liberalism. Every liberal goal was there before the Enlightenment. Everything that you wanted to argue, to defend, was there before the birth of liberalism. All liberty does not require and is not added to by liberalism. Indeed, I want to argue that it's actually a conservative philosophy that secures liberty and defends liberty from liberalism. Let me explain why. What is the core belief? What is the ontology, if you forgive me using that word, of liberalism? It is a belief in nothing. It is a belief that nobody can know anything, and it's a belief that nothing can be communicated. You doubt me, read Hobbes. You doubt me, read Locke. You doubt me, read Rousseau. The fundamental belief of liberalism is unconstrained will. It is Nietzschean. Because there are and is no legitimate constraint for liberalism. Because they do not accept, it's there, read Pierre Manon's books. It's all replete, it's all there. They don't believe that objective good exists. They don't believe that if an objective good exists, it could be known by us. And they don't believe that we can communicate objective goods between each other. As a result, they remove the very grounds of community from community. If you look again at Rousseau, who I think really stands behind modern liberalism and his concept of the general will, what he does in a sort of version of Leibnizian parallelism, if you forgive the term, is he says the general will is everybody thinks like me. He theorizes the group from theorizing the individual. And that general will, as you all know from undergraduate studies, is what licenses the French Revolution and the Revolutionary Terror. The idea that 19th century liberalism is not in some way logically related to modern totalitarian liberalism, I would question. There is no logical parameter internal to 19th century liberalism that prevents its slide into contemporary woke culture that is deeply oppressive. It's integral to it. It's one and the same. Why? Because it believes in nothing. Now, if you believe in nothing, if you think, and recall your Hobbes, why do we have a state? We have a state to stop men making war over the nature of the objective. And we say there is no objective, and we restrict the objective to the private sphere. And if you restrict the objective to the private sphere, what you ensure is a war of all against all. And what stops the war of all against all? The authoritarian state. So liberalism produces a conflict which it then produces the authoritarian power to resolve. And if all there is power, which is fundamentally what liberalism argues, in its ontology, then don't be surprised when liberalism becomes oppressive, because that's its logic. That's what it does. So there is no way to avoid the conflict on the move that James outlined. We simply have to articulate and enter the realm of objective statements about the good. There's a very simple way of saying this. Is a theory of rights. We all, in some sense, believe in rights. But what we don't have is an order of rights. So nobody can tell you why the right to life isn't the same as isn't on the same level as the right to wear blue socks on Tuesdays. If you want to decide between rights, you have to know what is right. And what is right isn't given from rights. You have to have an objective account, a scala entis, that tells you the order of goods, and only then can you produce what is called a distributional account of justice. There is no avoiding the objective. There is no avoiding the attempt to theorize the ultimate good for human beings. So when Danny says our aim is to produce good people, he's right, and he begs the right question: the nature of the good. Now, the eruption of the universal in human history didn't just happen in Israel. It happened in Greece, and it happened in Plato. 509b of the Republic, the epikeinia tes ousia, the good beyond being, where Plato said, unless we can create the idea of a good in a world of warring, brutal, centuries-long warfare between Greek city-states, unless we can create a good that all share in, there is no peace in the world, and we permanently have ongoing violence. Now, what this thesis means is quite interesting. So I agree also with Eric in his claim that all is culture. I want to build on that and turn it into an ontological thesis, building on Fustel de Coulanges' work. Let me give you the quote. This is from Cicero. Where there is no true justice, then there can be no association of men united in fellowship by common agreement as to what is right, and therefore no people in any proper sense at all. If you study and read ancient history, you recognize that the political dynamic there is between the cultus of the city and philosophical universals that were emerging and erupting through the culture. And as a result, what you have is the development, as Eric Voegelin has argued, within those cultures of the universals because they merge with other cultures. Now, this is primarily religious. If you look at Athenian battles, you will recall that the Athens executed some generals because they failed to bring back the bodies of the Athenian dead. It was required to bring back the bodies of the Athenian dead because they had souls. Because your task as an Athenian for your father was to bury him and serve him and feed his soul. So much so, and so believed with this, that the penalty for leaving a body behind was death. What this tells us is that the very notion of a people, the very notion of a polity, is religious and ideational. What this also tells us is that all ideation is religious and metaphysical in the sense that James outlined. It also, and this is, I won't quote from the essay because I'm running out of time and it will take too long, but let me give you the argument. What it also, in Voegelin argued that the idea of universals, the idea of things that apply to us all, only come about through empires. That empire is where people first start thinking about other people. I think this is right. I think this is clearly correct. And it leads to all sorts of interesting conclusions. Empires are the only thing that produces multiculturalism. Empires are the only thing that produce toleration of people from different ethnicities, different groups, different clans, castes, whatever you care to call it. It is not accidental that universals, in thinking all human beings are equal, emerge only in and through the practice of empire. And actually, if you look at human history, there never has been a stage of human history where there are nations that are not also imperial. There is no autarkic, self-enclosed, unless you live in Borneo, but even then they fight with each other. There is no non-imperial, non-empire human state beyond the tribe. Until very late in modernity, in post-empire situations where ethnic groups break up into ethnic political cantons that are called nations, or symbolized as language groups that are themselves protected by empires. Otherwise, they wouldn't exist because they'd be taken over by other empires. So conceived, the real political contest is between different versions of empire. All politics in the Western and non-Western is imperial, and all politics is empire. You remember the debate about civilizational war? That is where we are. We are in the middle of civilizational war and civilizational conflict. And it has always been thus. Liberalism is just another version of a civilizational war and a civilizational conflict. And I don't inveigh against it for that. What I inveigh against is the consequences of liberalism that are penal for the poor and that culturally eviscerate us so that we become nihilists, so that our universalism is nihilism. What this means for the post-liberal project is an eschewing of nationalism. Now, I love what's on offer from Poland and Hungary, and I've told this to the politicians. Nationalism is an act of self-harm. It necessarily means they cannot win the battles they want to fight. And if we as post-liberals want to win the account of how we ought to behave nationally and internationally, if we want to limit globalization, if we want to limit migration so that we can protect people in their home countries and allow them to foster, if we want to stop exploitative capitalism, if we want to stop imposing the sexual views of a tiny minority on majorities, we have to do internationalism. We have to recognize the fundamental political dialectic is between good empire and bad empire. And indeed, in Ukraine, that is what is already happening. Vogler makes a distinction between closed and open empires. Closed empires are those ethnic empires that seek to expand themselves but stay the same. That essentially is Russia. That was Germany. The elements that must oppose that must be us. It must be the post-liberals. We can't cede that just to a liberalism. We have to say, actually, in the civilizational project, what you're doing is murderous and needs to be opposed through an open empire. And if you doubt that empire is the precondition of social peace, if you doubt that only empire can defend difference, I urge you to look at the Roman Empire, which was the most egalitarian, open, and protective empire known in the ancient world. With the proclamation of 212, where all free citizens, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of class, regardless of place, became citizens of the empire. A universal project that built on the project of Alexander the Great, who repudiated Aristotle's idea that anyone who wasn't Greek was just a barbarian. This is the Western genius. This is the Western fusion. And this is also what Christianity upholds. That there is a shared universal in which all human beings can and should and do participate. And that is what we must defend. And we cannot reduce and precipitate out of that some ethnic, ethnocentric language group focus that reduces us to our contingent qualities as human beings. That would be many things, but it wouldn't be Christian. And what I like most about Middle Europe is its assertion of Christianity. So to conclude, an international post-liberal politics will be imperial. It will have to have the character of a good empire because there is no other political option. Thank you.
Thank you for that thought-provoking talk, Philip. I would like to go straight to the floor for questions. We've got around about 6 minutes for questions before we go to tea. Yeah, we got tea at 5:30. We go a bit longer if we would like, but tea will be available from then on. Start with the front.
Thank you so much. Question for Philip. Philip, I agree with much. And I think the idea of empires, civilizations, if you will, and that essentially they are in conflict with each other because they have competing telos or teloi. And absolutely. The bit that I struggle with is that when you say liberalism, and when you say, and I want to quote you, and I want to do this appropriately, not in some baggy way, liberals don't believe in anything. They don't believe in anything. Objective good exists. All there is power. I think that's the correct diagnosis. But whether you just use a different word than I would use, or whether you're shooting at profoundly a different target than I would shoot at, I hear postmodernism. I hear Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard. I agree with that performative falseness, that you only read postmodernists, you never meet them, because they say there's no objective reality, there is no telos, it's just a power grab. And those people, those profoundly post-war French thinkers, come out of a form of Marxism. So when you say liberal and you rage against all of these ills, and I don't disagree, I think they're ills of forms of Marxism, not liberalism.
What I would say is Marx was a Rousseauian liberal. And if you actually look at Marx was a Rousseauian liberal. And if you look at the ontology behind Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, it's exactly as I described it. I don't want to suggest that good people who are liberals believe in nothing. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the philosophy upholds, at base, nothing at all. It only believes in human will because it doesn't think there's anything else. It doesn't uphold a theory of substantive goods, which is what we need.
If I may just down one point. So, Gladstone, does that work for Gladstone as a self-confessed liberal, a liberal prime minister, committed Christian?
I think that what happens in history is you have a Venn diagram. What happens is that people have a habitus of foundations upon which they craft a liberalism. I don't object to that. But what I'm trying to say is if you're a thoroughly coherent liberal, you are a postmodernist.
Hello. It's Rod Dreher. This question is for Eric primarily, but others feel free to jump in. I agree very much that one of the problems with at least in my country, with the Republicans, is that the politicians will not do anything policy-wise to fight wokeness, and they don't really recognize the problem. What do you all think about what's being done here in Hungary under Prime Minister Orban? Because I think he's an interesting case for us to follow because he has used political power to push back on wokeness and to build a conservative deep state, this alternative culture of which James was talking. Can we talk about Orban and get your take on him and whether he's a useful model, and if so, why?
Yeah. Should I just go ahead here?
Yes, please.
Your point, okay. Dan's pointing somewhere else, but yeah. So my view is essentially that it is important to defend procedural liberalism. And so where I might be critical, let's say, of Orban, and I don't have all the details, but I would not support going against norms that govern protection of the Supreme Court or high courts, for example. I think it's, of course, necessary to have changeover of personnel in the courts and make sure that they are broadly reflecting the Constitution and so on. But and when it comes to universities, again, I do support the idea of governments intervening in the institutional mechanics of universities when they are abrogating academic freedom and or politically discriminating. So what I would prefer to see, rather than bans, for example, which I wouldn't support, what I would support for universities is to say, anything that you're doing on equity and diversity with regard to race and gender, you've got to do with regard to politics and ideology. So if that's tracking the beliefs of people who apply for jobs, if that is tracking who gets hired, if that is examining recruitment processes, promotion processes, language, all the things you want to do, you're going to have to do the same thing. And I think what that would do is actually achieve many of the same ends, but within a much cleaner procedural liberal framework. So it would check the political discrimination, which is rampant in these institutions. It would prevent them from taking political statements on BLM and other issues. I think this can be done within a liberal rubric, and I'm just not as comfortable with where Orban has gone on some of these things. Now, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't believe in sort of banning gender studies. I think what you can do is, for example, to say, I mean, if gender studies is an outgrowth of some kind of gender equity and diversity, I would like to see conservative, gender equity and diversity for conservatives to match that. Now, you don't have to do any of this, but I think that would really push against a lot of the anti-conservative bias and discrimination that's going on in these institutions without having to violate procedural liberal principles.
Yes, I have got three comments. One is to Eric. I bought the fight against cultural socialism, and I also bought the argument that we need the classical liberals. So I have no question. I really agree. I also bought what James offers us, that we need a conservatism which has a metaphysical foundation, even if I am concerned about its use in politics. So I would be careful how far that can be put into our political practice, because of, the idea that for example, the one that Berdyaev presented, that the origins of communism was based in the Orthodox faith. So it's easily turning into something which we don't want to as conservatives. But my real question is to my co-organizer, Philip, because I bought the idea that the nation is not the only thing that we should think, and that indeed the empire is something which is quite valuable and something that is historically part of the Western experience. However, my suggestion is this: we need to have a political philosophy on different levels, on the level of the local, on the level of the nation, and on the level of the empire. And I think they all need to live side by side, and we have to have this combination of the different scales in order to do it. And I also bought your argument that we need universal assumptions like about human nature. We should not give up on that. However, again, one should be careful about how to apply that into practical politics, because there, again, we are in danger to generalize and bring dogmatism into our politics, which we have to be careful to avoid. Thanks.
We'll carry on. Danny had his hand up next. Then it is Chris. Then it's the gentleman at the back, the gentleman with the coding there, and then it's the gentleman with the time. So it's in that order.
Okay, I'll try and be quick. So this is for Eric. On the practical policy of insisting on political and ideological diversity, would you be? Is in fact the intention there that they don't bother with diversity at all? I mean, would it be the preferable outcome that if they're required to do this quite complicated? I mean, it's a pretty subjective test to insist on sort of cognitive and intellectual diversity. Would you want them just to not do it, or would you actually require? Would you be happy for them to be doing all the race and sex tracking if they were also insisting on diversity and equity at an intellectual level?
Okay. Should we wait, or should I just go ahead? Yeah, I mean, yeah, my view on that is essentially they have a choice. They can either have nothing, which is fine, or but I suspect they're not going to want to give up on their equity and diversity for race and gender, in which case they're going to have to, and it's no hard thing. I mean, you can track people's ethnicity. It's all done through subjective tick box exercises. You can track how people voted and where they are on Brexit or whatever you want to use as your metric, and track, how many applied, how many got jobs, how many got promoted. You can do the same sort of thing that you do with other, and you can hold institutions to account. And I actually think this would help to arrest the leftward drift that we see. So yeah, I don't think it's any harder to monitor than ethnicity or religion or sexuality, which is already done on forms.
Well, I would take the questions and then we can try and answer them in the round. Yeah.
Eric, Chris Fair, University of Hull. I don't really have a concrete question for you because I just agree with what you say. So I'm sorry, I don't have anything. But apart from a possible thought, which is that Conservative government doesn't wish to impose its view of truth or the good life upon its citizens. It wants to lessen the severity of conflict. So it seems to me that they don't deal with this issue until it becomes a site of real conflict. And that leaves a dilemma for Conservatives, because they have to do something which is profoundly unconservative, which is to escalate the conflict on the thing that they want then to be resolved. It's surprising how many human resources people and the people involved in this kind of fake training don't recognize that there's a sort of a difference of opinion on it. They think that these sort of training sessions will achieve the harmony. So I think part of the job is actually to show them that it doesn't do that, that it is a site of conflict. James, I'm very sympathetic to your view of the kind of social justice woke religion as a religion, a profoundly Pelagian religion as well. With your knowledge of the history of metaphysics, with particularly theology, I wonder if you think that there are any lessons to be learned from similar movements in the past in what happens to them. One thing I'm often asked is, where is all of this going? This identity politics stuff. What are we still going to be talking about it in 10 years, or will it have backed itself into a corner? Is there a logic of a purity spiral and it just dies out? And Philip, as you were talking, thank you for your very interesting talk, I became aware that your position is much closer than I realized to that of Leo Strauss, particularly in natural right and history. It's the rediscovery of natural right. And there's a particularly fascinating part in that book. And I don't remember hearing you talk about Leo Strauss before. It may be that you know this better than I do. There's a particularly interesting part where he claims that the belief in a natural order, and the pursuit of it, of course, arises in multicultural ancient societies, and the interest in the good, the best constitution, and natural right comes out of that. But he thinks that because of the effect of historicism, philosophers have become conscious that their belief in natural right is itself just founded on an act of faith. And this means that for political philosophers, they're always faced with this eternal choice of Athens or Jerusalem. That's how he puts it. And each of them is essentially an arbitrary act. But the reason that I'm interested in your thoughts on Leo Strauss, perhaps, particularly, but more generally, is how you understand the relationship between what we or you are calling post-liberalism and casting your mind back 20 years, what was understood as neoconservatism. And of course, Leo Strauss at that time became associated with neoconservatism because of a trashy book by Shadia Drury, which tied his philosophy to the war in Iraq. But how do you understand the relationship between those two terms?
For me, please.
Thank you. I would ask that shouldn't we consider that firstly the whole theory of liberalism is embedded of Calvinism and Presbyterianism and the predestination of theory of Calvinism on one hand. On other hand, the whole wokeism is, if we see the history of the Gnostic sects, if we can find the same things, the hidden truth, the chosen few who know the hidden truth, and the whole esotery of and the whole symbols and whole self-esteem. And my second, what I would like to say that about Marx, that Marx himself said that slavery was a very good thing at that time, and he was very appreciated about the culture of Greeks and Romans, and said that first, he is not a Marxist. Second, that he is not a cultural relativist. So, so the today woke hysteria, they use the name of Marx without knowing his works.
Thank you. The gentleman with the white shirt, please.
Hi, so I definitely agree that procedural liberalism is essential, but it doesn't have the kind of cultural strength to defend itself. That's why we need the alternative clarity and idea of universal good. But one thing that like wokeism, or whatever we call it, has going for it is that regardless of the theory, which might theoretically be about nothing, in practice, like people who are motivated by that believe in justice, equality, striving for perfection, and a lot of what woke people claim, but like exaggerate, is rooted in real injustice. It's not just complete nonsense. So there's all that is rooted in Christian ideals. They're all Christian ideals. So, and for them, social conservatives appears to be just saying, oh, go away with your extremist nonsense, leave us to go about our own lives, just business as usual, please. But I think we all agree that there's a kind of cultural vacuum created by late liberalism, and that wokeness is essentially filling it, and it can fill it because it's a kind of a shadow of Christianity, and it has some of that Christianity. But so to counter that, it seems like there needs to be something that's equally, or ideally more inspiring, probably rooted in Christianity, maybe partly overtly Christianity. But I think that there needs to be more of an, I'm very interested in ideas on what that idea of the good, the idea of like a life living, trying to be more perfect, of trying to improve things, having a concept of justice, looks like from a post-liberal perspective.
Gentleman there.
Thank you. István Szabadföldi from Doctoral School of Military Engineering. I have a question to Philip Blond. Having heard, your explanation regarding the imperium versus the nation state, and then the ethnicity, the languages, and the good imperium, and so forth. Two issues. One of them is that the Bible clearly says, as your example about the Roman Empire, and describe it as a beast who is crushing the enemy and devours what it can, and what cannot, it's actually trample on. That's in the book of Daniel. So, and we know that in the Roman Empire there was exactly at those times which you referred to, horrible persecution against the Christians. So that's the first thing. And I try to understand in your terms of coordinate, your very example regarding the current crisis in Ukraine. We have an empire, Russia, which is going against the nation state, which became a liberal nation state in the last couple of years. And that liberal nation state introduced the language law, which basically was oppressive against the other ethnicities than the Ukrainians. Now, it worked, and in many other countries, it works until one of those oppressed ethnicity will have a much stronger supporter. And what happened today, is basically that was the course of actions, in the last couple of years, and it culminated in a very brutal response from the empire. So how would you explain in your coordinate of terms, political terms, that phenomenon? Thank you.
So the point I'm making is that nation states are a late modern fallout from empires, and that empires form often at the edge of other empires in resistance to empires that are forming. Rome, in large part, was an empire that arose after the Greeks failed to create an empire that was sufficient to resist Persian incursion. So the point is there is no non-empire option. Ukraine is relying upon a civic empire, which is the West and the EU, and in order to be saved from an ethnic empire. And I agree with you about the language law. I thought that was a completely tragic error. Absolutely. On Judaism and Christianity, it's very clear in the Christian reception of the Roman Empire that they didn't think it was a bad thing. Augustine is very clear in Civitas Dei that there are many reasons to value Rome, because essentially it's a universalism that is further perfected by Christianity, and that the conflict in the pagan world is that the pagan virtues value honor and glory. And the trouble is honor and glory puts the pagan city at risk, because the pagan city will be risked for personal honor and glory. So what Augustine argues is essentially honor and glory is replaced by other virtues that can protect the city by being part of a wider compact. And it's irrefutable that Rome produced the most open society known in the ancient world. So what I am saying is that the ultimate contest is between different versions of universalism. Now, to the question that was raised by Ferenc, and is that ultimately, I believe in a Christian version of universalism, which has at every level a protection of difference. The fundamental philosophy of a Christian polity is the protection of difference. If you look at Christian empires, the Holy Roman Empire, for example, protects federalism, distinction, and relative rule. It has an incredibly strong history that does exactly as you asked, for the different legitimacy to be given to each level. The empires that crush difference are the mono-empires, the closed empires that Vogelin talked about, that the empires of one people, one ethnicity that crush all authority. The distinctive mark of Christian empire is the notion that difference is protected. And the philosophical point is that it's not a monism. What you have if you read Thomas Aquinas in Summa Contra Gentiles, book 1:3, he says, what do you see when you see God? You see all that he has made. The one is already pluralized in Christianity. So what you have in the Christian polity isn't a henology enacted upon a diverse people. What you have is a henology saying all this diversity is me. And the key task for a diversity is peace between the diversity I brought about. And then finally, to your Straussian point, in a way that would be my response to Straussian and neocon universalism. What they have, because it's secular, really, it's the pagan rather than the Christian universal, is they essentially enforce a bad empire. They are the people who say, let's drop bombs for democracy, right? They're the people who say, well, they treat women differently here, so let's kill them all with our weaponry. And so what I think is missing in my American friends' approach is I do not think we can be silent in the face of what they're doing in Ukraine. And there is no localist opt-out that Christians can uphold. But what we can do is talk about the sort of international empire or polity we will defend and we will die defending. And that's what we should do vis-a-vis Ukraine. James?
Yeah. Could I just go ahead here? I was just going to... Okay, fine. Sorry, I didn't want to jump the gun here. I'm just going to respond to Chris's excellent points. And what I want to say is that I think the Tories are, like other conservative parties, extremely naive about a lot of these issues. So right now in Canada, where I'm from originally, the Ontario Conservative government just passed essentially a bill that will give the green light to critical race theory being mandatory in the school system because it was badged as anti-racist. So behind the velvet glove of kind of anti-racism, anti-fascism, diversity and inclusion comes something a lot more authoritarian, and a lot of conservatives either are too stupid to see it, or because they're only interested in lowering taxes or foreign policy, are not interested. And I think this is really at the heart of, I think, the problem that we face, is opening people's eyes. But you can see this in survey questions that I've run. Academics, for example, if you take social science, humanities academics, 3/4 of them are in favor of political correctness. More of them favor mandatory race and gender quotas on reading lists than oppose them. But if you then say, well, okay, what are you going to do to somebody who doesn't want to change their reading list? Are you going to fire them? Very few of them will go the distance. So they don't want to go the distance, which is actually, they don't want to face the flip side of the coin that they endorse. And I think the task for a lot of us is to actually say, if you want to endorse diversity statements and mandatory quotas on reading lists, the flip side of that is punishment for those who refuse, and you're not going to be able to do anything about that. So this is where I think the Conservatives really have to be educated and open their eyes to the scale of the threat that is emerging. And I just think a lot of them have been hoodwinked by the packaging.
Chris, to your point, does anyone know where the brakes are on this phenomenon? And the short answer is no, I don't think anybody does. And I think there's a lot, work says there's a lot of ruin in a nation, and goodness knows how long it will take for this to unravel. And there's that line of Horace, isn't it? It's something like, well, let's see if I can remember my Latin, naturam expellas furca tamen usque recurret. You can force nature out with a fork, but it will come running back again. And so in the end, it's got to fail. It's got to unravel as this hyper-liberalism, to use John Gray's word that you termed earlier, that you used earlier, as it tries to liberate us from deeper and deeper constraints, indeed our very bodies. Then we're going to start to see some, I think, very unpleasant political conflict. We're starting to see this in the classroom, the sort of school teacher union meetings in the United States. We actually saw an interesting electoral outworking in Virginia, of course, last year with the election of Glenn Youngkin. When it comes to parental rights and children, Conquest First law kicks in. Everybody's conservative about the thing they know best. So in our country, in the UK, it's actually been Muslim communities, I think it was somebody drew attention to this earlier, that have been protesting the LGBTQ ideology being rolled out in schools. So we're going to see, I think, a lot more of that. Whether that's where it ends, I don't know. Of course, the other thing to note is the extraordinary courage of gender-critical feminists like Kathleen Stock, J.K. Rowling, and so on. Again, that's a sort of an example of hyper-liberal overreach where the brakes do seem to be kicking in, but at great personal cost to them. And it'll be interesting to see, bearing in mind Eric's stats, as things, it does seem like, as he said, the hour is late and the window is closing. And as the demographics begin to take their work, and I think Eric would agree that this is not an age effect, it's a cohort effect. That is to say, it's going to persist all the way through. We're running out of time to use state mechanisms to do something about it. Just very quickly, the gentleman in the white shirt. Yes, I think we should. It's too easy for us to, I think, criticize and kind of cheapen the genuine moral indignation and energy behind a lot of these movements, behind the woke phenomenon. But I simply just don't accept that when they use words like social justice and equality, that we're talking about the same thing. When equality simply means elevating certain demographics over other demographics because of something that their ancestors might have done once upon a time, we're surrendering the most basic commitment shared by moral philosophers throughout history, namely that whatever else culpability is, whatever else moral responsibility is, it's individual human agency. And what we're seeing in this phenomenon are claims about what I call synchronic group guilt. That is to say that you're implicated in the guilt of something that somebody's done in virtue of completely contingent and morally irrelevant physiological characteristics. And there's diachronic group guilt, namely that you are, in virtue of your completely irrelevant, morally irrelevant contingent physiological characteristics, complicit in some crime that was done 200 years before against somebody else, and the victimhood there is also diachronic. So I just think the whole starting point and framework is fundamentally unjust, and it needs to be called out as such.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We are almost 25 minutes over, so if we could go and have tea, be back here instead of 6, could we try at 6:15, and we could keep the discussion going and catch up a little bit on the time. Thank you very much indeed.